Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. It's a nice crowd. We appreciate you making the effort on a Sunday afternoon. I just want to welcome you to the Wellesley Historical Society's speaker series. This series is made possible by our generous sponsor, Christine Meyer, and today is presented in partnership with the Wellesley Society of Artists and Wellesley Free Library. So may you please welcome Nancy Trevis, the president of the Wellesley Society of Artists.
On behalf of the Wellesley Society of Artists, I'd like to thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'd also like to thank the Wellesley Historical Society and the Wellesley Free Library for making it possible. This has been an incredibly important year for the Wellesley Society of Artists as we celebrate our 90th anniversary. It has taken a dedicated community of artists over decades to ensure that the arts continue to strengthen the cultural values in our community. While the majority of the WSA membership is artists, we also welcome associate members who enjoy the arts and want to support the arts in our community. We believe that art is for everyone, and making it a part of our lives enriches our well-being, whether you are an artist or an observer of art, and we're all observers. So if you'd like to be added to our mailing list to hear about our programs, we have a sign-up list right over here on the table. I have the distinct pleasure and privilege of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Robert Savage, to whom we are incredibly thankful for making the WSA history accessible to all of us. Dr. Savage is a retired surgeon, assistant clinical professor at Harvard Medical School, and past president of the New England Society of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgeons. He's a lifelong art lover and started a second career in 2016 as a local art historian, collector, and now artist. He currently curates 2 art blogs on Facebook, the Wellesley Collection Art Review and Friends of the Rockport Art Association and Museum. He has published over 100 brief biographies on askart.com and consulted for the Massachusetts Horticultural Society on art acquisitions. His personal collection has been featured in the American Fine Art magazine, and he is a frequent art history contributor to the Wellesley Weston magazine, where his career transition from physician to artist was featured in the 2022 summer edition. He is an exhibiting member and board member of the Wellesley Society of Artists. His current writings and lectures focus on women artists of the early 20th century. The WSA is indebted to Bob for all the work that he has done to bring to life the history and the artists whose vision became the Wellesley Society of Artists. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the Wellesley Free Library first for hosting this event and for all they do for the fine arts around the great community of Wellesley. I also want to thank the Wellesley Society of Artists for allowing me to speak. A couple of years ago, when I decided to apply to try to become an exhibiting member with the society, I was a novice painter and I was just doing it somewhat on a lark, and I got a beautiful letter one day from Nancy saying, "You're in." And I thought, holy crap, did they even look at my paintings that I sent them? I said, what's wrong with these people? And it reminded me of a joke from the old comedian Groucho Marx, who said, I'm somewhat reticent to join any organization that would choose me as a member. And finally, but not last, thanks to the Wellesley Historical Society, especially Taylor. Taylor and I have worked on at least a half a dozen significant projects over the last 5 years or so, and I appreciate her help each and every time. And I think it's also a beautiful cross-pollination between the Historical Society and the Arts Society, because the Historical Society preserves and cares for many pieces of artwork and archival material of the most important founding members of the Wellesley Society of Artists. So there's a beautiful treasure trove of material within the Historical Society, which I tapped into in preparing these talks. So I'm really excited to be here this morning. As Nancy said, I'm a retired surgeon. You know, when you're being trained to be a surgeon, you're trained to be calm, kind of, even keel, maintain your cool. You don't want to get too excited. But now that I'm retired and I'm in the art world, I'm really excited to be here today. And especially because I think there's a beautiful sort of circle of life going on here, because we'll be talking about almost a century of fine art in this great community of Wellesley as we go on. And we're surrounded by the main exhibition of the current Wellesley Society of Artists at the same time. So we have the past, the present, and we even have the future up front. Some of the two of the first three paintings as you enter the room are from high school students at Wellesley High School, and the Society sponsors an Art Achievement Award, which we give out each year to worthy students in the high school. And I would guess that if you didn't look at the names, you wouldn't be able to distinguish the high school work versus much of the work in the society. They're so good. So if you're home watching your television, if you're either watching a movie or you're watching a series on TV, if it's a popular show, then they also have to make a sequel, and they have to then make a prequel to make more money. So I thought we'd start with a prequel of the Wellesley Society of Artists. And what I mean by that is you could make an argument that we're older than our 90 years. Officially, the society became to be as an official organization in 1933, i.e. the 90 years. But the nucleus and the idea of having a group like we have now started 9 years before that, about 99 years ago. As I was doing a deep dive and researching, trying to figure out what I wanted to say about the society and its history, I came across this book. It's a little booklet that was written in 1928 by the Wellesley Hills Women's Club. And that year, within the book, which is actually, there's an original copy on the table if anyone cares to glance at it, they started an art department within the Women's Club. And it turned out to be one of the more popular items within the Women's Club, and went on for the next decade or so. But it was sort of a combination of arts and crafts. There were painters and sculptors, and they did ceramics and weaving and jewelry and even bookbinding and several other things. So it wasn't exclusive to the fine arts. Nevertheless, the two rock stars, even in 1924, were Elizabeth Hamilton Thayer Huntington, who by far was the driving force to having our society created way back in 1933. And even before that, at least 10 years before that, she was the driving force of all the art circles in the town of Wellesley. She was an extremely organized, energetic person, and also an extremely talented artist in her own right. So she became the first president of the art department of the Women's Club. And the first guest speaker was Mary Brewster Hazelton, who is the rock star of the Wellesley Historical Society. Wellesley Historical Society has close to 60 of Mary Brewster Hazelton's paintings within their care. Mary Brewster Hazelton, we'll talk a little bit more about her later, but in a nutshell, none other than John Singer Sargent said that Mary Brewster Hazelton was one of the best portrait painters of her entire era. So that's how good she was. So we're moving on to another character. This is Theo Alice Ruggles Kitston. And she was a member of the Women's Club, but she was a sculptor. And she presented there with the Women's Club and so on and so forth. And after the artists, meaning the painters and the sculptors, had been doing this for a while, Theo was sort of instrumental in saying, we need something a little bit different, something more specific for our needs, better places to exhibit and strut our stuff and discuss things and exchange ideas. And they started sort of having a nucleus of an idea of forming a formal society. So Theo was sort of instrumental, along with Mrs. Huntington and Mary Brewster Hazelton, in terms of starting to think about eventually breaking away from the women's club and starting their own art-related society. Now, Theo had a very interesting personal history. She was a child prodigy in terms of drawing and painting and playing with clay, and her mother realized that, and she thought, well, this is something that we want to foster and expand. So at this point, Theo was probably 13 or 14 years of age, and her mother sort of shopped her around to all the main art schools in the greater Boston area, and everybody turned her down, not because she wasn't skilled enough, but some said she was too young. Other people hypothesized it was also because she was a female, and they didn't really encourage young women getting their hands dirty in those days. But nevertheless, her mother persisted, and she got some advice from someone at the school, said, well, you need to get her a tutor. So she found Henry Kitson, who was a rising star sculptor, to tutor her. So she started under the tutelage of Mr. Kitson, who was always already a well-known artist. And lo and behold, by the time she was 19, she was in Paris exhibiting at the Salon of Artists Francais, and became the first woman and the youngest person to win an award at this august institution. So the tutelage worked out very well, and 7 or 8 years later, it got even better when the teacher and the student actually married. And Theo continued to be a terrific artist. There are hundreds of her pieces, large public sculpture pieces all around the United States. And some of you will recognize the work of her husband locally. He was the sculptor of the Minuteman in Lexington Green. You can see some of Theo's work still in the Boston area. This is in the Boston Public Gardens, her sculpture of Kosciuszko, the famous Revolutionary War hero. So Theo is an interesting story. She was also the driving force to pushing our group forward into actually making a formal organization. The other extremely important person is Elizabeth Hamilton Thayer Huntington. She had quite the pedigree. She was a descendant from the Alexander Hamilton's family. She was also descended from the family of General Thayer, who was one of the first heads of West Point, and also Thayer Academy here in Massachusetts was named in his honor and through his will. So this is Elizabeth's life story is something that movies were made of. So I'll go through a bit of that as we go along. And she was definitely the principal founder. She was an extremely talented artist. She was an organizer. She could, she had most of the early exhibitions in her house before they could find other places to play. And this is a picture of her when she was young. She used to love to go up with her future husband into the White Mountains of New Hampshire and paint there in the back of her jalopy. I want you to remember something about this picture. There's a brace on her elbow, if you notice, and there's sort of a special table that has been designed so that she could draw or paint while she was in her car. And I'll explain that in a little while. But the rest of her life was a real profile and courage. This is the type of thing that she was able to accomplish. And she was well trained at what was called the Boston Normal School, which is now the Mass College of Art. And she had a budding art career starting in her 20s. And she became engaged to be married. And everything, the world was her oyster until she was struck with polio in her 20s. And she developed partial paralysis of her shoulder and her elbow of her dominant arm, still had use of her wrists and her fingers. She approached her future husband. She said, it's really not fair for you to have to marry me because I'm going to be a cripple for the rest of my life. And she was also wheelchair bound, unfortunately, after she got polio. And her husband said, nothing doing, this is like a love story that you can't imagine. He said, we're going through with this wedding and, we're going to be here thick and thin and do whatever's necessary. And you're going to be painting again before we're done. So this was their house on Worcester Street. I think the house is still there, right on Route 9. Doesn't look much from today's standards, but this was quite the place because this was the first home really, or the prequel of the Wellesley Society of Artists. All the good artists in Wellesley and actually surrounding vicinities would come to her house, and they would put on exhibitions, they would talk to each other, they would have demonstrations, but it was much more than that. They would also have occasionally poetry readings, they would have book readings, they'd have sometimes classical music, live music, tea parties. So it had been analogized to a Parisian salon, a la Gertrude Stein. So this was her house, and you can see on the far left sort of a peak of her studio, which was on the back of the house. And this is a sketch that she did of the house, and you can see the studio was probably more than half the size of the house, so it could accommodate a few people. So this is the other hero of the story, is Ray, her husband. This is a sketch of Ray that she had done when he was older. And this is him when he was a little bit younger, when they used to go up to the New Hampshire woods and draw or paint or sketch. He was also an early member of the Wellesley Society of Artists, but was primarily a businessman. So after a while, she needed some therapy and so on and so forth. She was very depressed because she felt she would never get back to her painting, which was all of her life up to that point. And she had a really good cheerleader with Raymond, her husband. Literally, when she was first recovering, he used to physically support her forearm so that she could paint and draw with just her wrist and hand. And ultimately, they had various braces, and he made special drawing boards for her so she could continue in spite of her disabilities. And he was always encouraging her, and she never got her confidence back that her work was good enough. So one day he loaded a bunch of her paintings in his car, and he drove down to Newbury Street, and there was a well-known gallery at the time, Dahl and Richards, and dropped 10 or 20 paintings, and they said, yeah, these are terrific. They sold out immediately. So that really got her confidence back really for the rest of her life. And she continued to be a moving force and longest acting president of the Wellesley Society of Artists. She was the president for almost 20 years and the first vice president. This is an example of a still life that she's done that's now in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum. So the couple had one child, Betty. Her name actually was also Elizabeth Huntington, which got pretty confusing because she got to be a pretty darn good artist herself. So normally she was known as Betty, but if there was an exhibition or some PR done or newspaper things, he became known as Elizabeth Huntington II, which I thought was interesting. So if you saw her in the Boston Globe, they had to distinguish her from mom. And she became quite the artist herself, and was a longstanding important member of the Art Society, including being a secretary treasurer. Many times painted in a charming folk-like style. You probably recognize this as Wellesley Square in the early 1940s, and this and another picture that you'll see later on are also in the collection of the Wellesley Historical Society. She ultimately became an honorary member for all of the contributions that she made, in addition to the contributions that her mother made. So we're moving along with the end of the prequel. So around 1930, a few people, probably Theo and Elizabeth and one or two others said, well, where are we going to go? Where are we going to show our stuff? And they said, well, Wellesley College, maybe. But they were very pessimistic. They said, oh, they're probably not going to be interested in that sort of thing. And I don't think Elizabeth was particularly shy, although I did not know her personally. I think that she probably learned the old saw that if you don't ask, you don't get. So they approached the Wellesley College art department, and to their great surprise, they were welcomed with open arms. And it was not yet the Wellesley Society of Artists, but it was pretty much the core same artists that eventually became founding members of our society. That started in 1930 with their first exhibition at Wellesley College. And the townsmen in those days, and this is also an excuse for me to say happy Thanksgiving to you all. This is a townsman a few decades behind. The townsman was very proud. They had big headlines. They were very proud. They said Wellesley, in addition to being a educational, civic, a philanthropic, and social activity hub, it can now add the advantages of an artistic community as well. And there was also a bunch of rumors going around that maybe a more formal organization might be in the offering in the near future. So this was the very first exhibit in 1930, pre-WSA's first exhibit. And if you notice, this is an important point, the artists of Wellesley and vicinity. Some people say, well, what is the Wellesley Society of Artists? It sounds like a stuffy, closed club or something like that. But even from the very beginning, even before it was a society, it welcomed artists from all the surrounding suburban areas around Boston. And today we have members not just from Wellesley, but pretty much everywhere, even some from out of state, I think, Nancy, don't we? So they convinced them, the Wellesley College to cooperate with their exhibitions, and the Farnsworth Museum there became the principal site for the early WSA exhibitions. And that continued for, approximately 25 years into the 1950s, when they were sort of mothballing the Farnsworth at that time and moving their things and other priorities to different locations. And then the relationship sort of slowly broke down in that transition. So there were only 13 founders when 1933 came along. The first president was Charles Aiken, who was a very important artist and organizer. He had studios both in Wellesley and in New York City. He was trained at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts School, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. And he became an important national figure. He was the head of what is called the Allied Artists of America organization out of New York City. He had a gallery in New York City that he used to promote other artists' work, in addition to running the Wellesley Society of Artists for the first 8 or 9 years with the help of Elizabeth Huntington. He was an expert oil painter, but he also invented a unique technique where he figured out how to make a print of a cement mold somehow. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. The School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, late 19th century, early 20th century, was where most, not all, but most of the early members of the society trained. And fun fact, this is the building of the original Museum of Fine Arts, but this building was on Copley Square. It's not where probably pretty much everybody in this room recognizes it in Huntington Avenue, because for several decades it was on Copley Square. So this was where both their exhibitions and their school was located. And it became arguably the most important art school in the United States. It was said at that time that their students won more awards than any other art school in the US at the time. And that was due in large part to these two men. Some of you may be familiar with these two of the most important American artists at that time, Edmund Tarbell and Frank Benson. These were two expert artists who sort of lived parallel lives. They were born in the same year in the 19th century. They entered the School of the Museum of Fine Arts within 1 year of each other. After they graduated, they, like many good art students, they extended their education by going over to Europe for a year or two if they could, or if they could afford it, to go through the museums and learn from some of the masters there. So the two of them went to the Académie Julian in Paris together and were roommates while in Paris, and then they came back home. And in the late 19th century, Edmund became the head of the school. And then within a year, named his friend the head of the painting department at the school, Mr. Benson. Now, while they were over in Europe, they fell in love with the Dutch masters, especially Vermeer, Spanish masters like Velázquez, and they were also exposed to the French Impressionists who were starting to bubble up around those times. And they brought the things that they learned back to the U.S. So you can see on the right, this is two pieces by Mr. Tarbell, who on the right sort of is reminiscent of a Vermeer kind of a genre interior scene. And on the left is very sort of French impressionistic. And the students became famous in and of themselves, and they were grateful to their teachers. And the next generation of artists were known as Tarbellites, because they basically used the same techniques that they learned from the two grand masters. And Benson was so well liked by his students, they simply called him the master. He, of course, became one of the greatest American Impressionists that we've ever had. So the connection is that the Wellesley Society of Artists, most of the early members were taught by these men. So one of my personal favorites is Mary Brewster Hazelton, who now lives at the Wellesley Historical Society. And I've written about her in the past, and a lot of the reproductions that you'll see are in the archives of the Historical Society. So this is Mary in the middle when she was a young girl. At those days, they used to call her Daisy. Daisy was her nickname when she was that young. The two drawings that you see, by the time she was 10 or 12 years old, she was doing drawings like this from Lewis Carroll's, Alice in Wonderland. So the parents must have said, maybe we've got something here. And boy, did they ever. So they encouraged her art development. And this is sort of what she was capable of producing, a couple of decades later. This is actually the Hazelton family. This painting is at the Historical Society. She had two sisters on the left. Her father was one of the early physicians here in the town of Wellesley, and he was an early pioneer in mental health. He actually ran a couple of asylums before he moved his practice to the town of Wellesley. Kind of interesting and coincidentally, their home was immediately adjacent to the future Wellesley History Center on Washington Street. It doesn't exist there anymore. It still exists. It was put on a jack on a truck and driven over by Mass Bay College. So their original house still exists, but not in its location next to the Historical Society's property. She also had a brother who was an interesting fellow. He was the president of his high school class here in Wellesley High School and went to MIT, probably because his father, the physician, said, don't be an artist because you'll starve. Well, of course, like a lot of kids who are good artists, he didn't listen to his father, and he became a heck of an artist. He taught at the Rhode Island School of Design for quite a while. Then he moved to New York with his family and was a major artist illustrator in New York City, doing magazines, newspaper pieces, advertisements, war bond posters for World War I. So Mary Brewster Hazelton eventually also got to the Museum of Fine Arts School. This is her when she was at the school. They used to have these fancy costume festivals once a year at the school. This is her in the costume. And she made quite an impression there. And now this is, if you went to the museum school in those days, this was not like going to a few weekend workshops or going there in night school while you were doing something else. This was a 6 or 7 year process to actually graduate from the Museum of Fine Arts. So this was, and most people didn't end up completing their diploma. But Mary Brewster Hazelton completed her diploma, and she was so good, they immediately asked her to join the faculty. So she stayed on the faculty of the school for a few years until she got a long-term studio at the famous historic Fenway Studios, where she painted shoulder to shoulder with people like Benson and Tarbell for the next 30 years. Now, while she was studying and working at the school, the Page family developed for the first time a traveling fellowship, which gave a student, a worthy student, a generous stipend so they could spend a couple of years in Europe for going through the museums and talking to the artists over there. And the very first year that they offered the traveling fellowship, who won? Of course, Mary Brewster Hazelton, our star. Another big artistic coup that she pulled off in her early career, perhaps the most prestigious place to show her wares in those days was the National Academy of Design. So they had a famous award that everyone coveted, the Hall Garden Award. But up until the year that Mary submitted a painting, it was only offered to men. So you couldn't apply to try to receive the award until that year. So the very first year that it was available to have candidates who were both male and female, who won? Mary Brewster Hazelton. So she was quite something. Now, some of you might not be familiar with you. So she's an interesting character, but probably you know a little bit more than you might think. Anybody who's been in the library probably is familiar with the portrait of Mr. Honeywell, which lives on the stairs between the first and second floor of the library here, and also is cared for by the Historical Society. People who are affiliated with the Wellesley Hills Congregational Church may have seen her wonderful murals. This is her kind of at the height of her power. 1915, there was a giant exposition in San Francisco, the Pan-Pacific exhibition, which essentially was what we would call the World's Fair. And they used to all, in those days, they all had big art exhibitions that were very competitive. And she won a bronze medal there in 1915 for her painting Revelry. And then a couple of years later, she won a major award for the letter in Newport. I'll move on to some other early important figures. Agnes Abbott, coincidentally in 1933, or not, maybe not so coincidentally, became a professor at Wellesley College in the art department. That was the same year that the official first exhibition of the society was made. So Agnes was actually an early member of the society. So I think she obviously had an affinity and helped to shepherd her friends and colleagues to the college and kept it going for over 2 decades. She was an interesting person as well. She was born in Germany, did a lot of her early training in Berlin, then her family moved to the States. She got additional training in Boston. She had some training on Cape Cod and Provincetown, some training by the famous artist Charles Woodbury, who started the Gunquit art colony up in Maine, and also was a part-time teacher at Wellesley College himself. And this painting obviously shows his influence. He had these beautiful beach scenes and seascapes. She also had a little bit of training with Audrow Hibbard, who was one of the best known 20th century Cape Ann painters. And many Cape Ann artists love to go to this quarry in the Rockport area and paint it for its shadows and colors, so forth. So in the early years, there was only maybe 12 or 15 people exhibiting at the Wellesley College shows. So they would occasionally invite their friends who were not yet members, but were well-established, amazing artists in their own right. They would invite them to exhibit with the Wellesley Society of Artists. And one of the artists was one of my favorites, Gertrude Fisk, who was also an MFA trained woman. And the sketch on the right is by Charles Woodbury of Gertrude with her dog. And she would spend summers up in Gunquit learning how to paint with Mr. Woodbury, who interestingly enough was said to have taught his students to paint with verbs, not nouns. And I always thought that was a great way of putting it, painting with verbs, because he was into broad brushstrokes and action and so on and so forth. And this somewhat eclectic, but I think very interesting portrait of a young woman named Mary is still in the collection of Wellesley College. This is sort of Gertrude in her heyday. This is the type of things that she could produce, but she was not a one-trick pony. By many standards, she was felt to be the best artist of the second generation of the Boston School, the first generation being Tarbells and the Bensons. But she was also one of the founders of the Weston Historical Society. She was a longtime library trustee of the Weston Library, even though the first half of her career was in Boston, sort of second half of her life was in Weston. She was the first woman to ever be invited to join the Mass Commission on Art. And even before she got going in her painting career, she won the Massachusetts Amateur Golf Championship and was an equestrian, and even taught herself how to drive a truck during World War I, just in case they needed extra ambulance drivers. So she was quite a force as well. Another guest, fascinating story, is Meta Fuller, who I didn't know until I was researching some of the guests that had exhibited with the society. And she was one of the first and most important African-American sculptors. She was born and trained mainly in Philadelphia, but was discriminated against because of her race in many ways in Philadelphia. And like many great artists, also went over to Paris to learn from some of the masters in Paris and extend her training. And she found Paris, much more welcoming compared to the city of brotherly love. Let's put it that way. While in Paris, another, amazing individual, she came under the wing of none other than Rodin, who, after working with her a while and appreciated her skills, just said, you were born to be a sculptor. She was that good. While she was in Paris, she also met W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous civil rights advocate and one of the founders of the NAACP. And he had long talks with her and convinced her that she really should spend a good bit of her artistic talent taking on the challenges of presenting the history and the trials and tribulations of the African American community, which he did. And many of her things are still available. She got married and eventually spent most of her working adult life living in Framingham. The Danforth Museum has a lot of her works and other ephemera related to her work. And this is an example of one of her sculptures, which you can see on the Boston Heritage Tour, which is in the Harriet Tubman Park in Boston, called Emancipation. So there were some really great things about the School of Fine Arts in Boston. These artists were unbelievably well trained, but they were kind of stodgy and they were kind of rigid. In 1914, there was a famous art show in New York City called the Armory Show. And this was the first time that people like Matisse and Picasso and some of the sort of avant-garde European artists were exposed to any American artist. And this created a major national stir. And people like Benson and Tarbell, I'm sure they thought that that kind of stuff was just a whole bunch of hooey. And it took about literally an extra 10 years before even a small version of those types of artists to be presented to a Boston artist, because they sort of fought the changes in the art world tooth and nail. But the Wellesley Society of Artists was very open-minded, not that they were radical, but especially from the philosophy of Elizabeth Huntington. She said, well, our society is an open society. We have no prejudice of any particular style or any particular school of art. And, if you're a good artist and you're interested in our society and you're competent, we'll consider you joining. So some of the early fantastic Boston modernists kind of spent some time with the Wellesley Society of Artists, including Mr. Carl Cutler. He was from Newtonville, and again, the Wellesley Society of Artists is not just a Wellesley club, from its very beginnings. Welcome to you from all over Massachusetts. And he went to the MFA school, but also went to Paris with three of his friends. And he and three of his friends became some of the early Boston modernists. He in particular was interested in color theory and eventually wrote an important book on modern color in the 1920s. He also fell in love with the Penobscot Bay in Maine and would go up almost every year for roughly 35 years and paint beautiful watercolors like this one of Penobscot Bay, and became an important part of the history of main art next to the Wyeths and Winslow Homer and John Martin and so on and so forth. Well, his good friend from Brookline was Charles Pepper, who was also a very early member of our group. He was also a groundbreaking member. So Mr. Pepper and Mr. Cutler were part of the Boston Four. So who were the other two? So the other two students were part of the Boston Modern Group, were Maurice Prendergast, who many of you, if you're artists, I'm sure you're aware of that name, and Ambrose Webster, who became a big part of the Provincetown Art School and community. So they were the four Boston artists, and they were welcome at the Wellesley Society of Artists. And Mr. Pepper brought that with him. He became the director of two important art clubs in Boston, and he made sure that if the person was confident that their modern paintings could be exhibited at the same time as more traditional realistic ones. Earl Edward Sanborn was a painter who was in the first exhibitions in Wellesley College with the society. And then he met a man named Charles Connick, who was probably the world's premier expert in Gothic stained glass making. And he was tutored by Mr. Connick and sort of shifted gears from his painting career to making these exquisite stained glass materials. I think he is a good example of sort of the versatility of some of the many members of the Art Society. And he went on to produce these gorgeous windows at Boston College, Trinity College, the National Cathedral in Washington, among many other places. So we're moving on towards the middle of the century, the Depression era and World War II. And the Depression era was not kind to a lot of artists. A lot of artists just stopped painting, or they painted on the side and tried to get some other work if it was available during those days, and just sort of tried to make do as best they can. On the other hand, the Wellesley Society of Artists kind of still forged ahead. They had their first exhibition in the 1930s for younger people at Dana Hall in 1936. The exhibits at Wellesley College continued, but were somewhat less frequent during the war for obvious reasons. So the society has always been big into philanthropy, and they sort of changed their focus. In addition to the exhibitions, put some of their energies into various philanthropic endeavors, including trying to help the Red Cross for World War II efforts. They financially sponsored a large number of orphans who were displaced by war in China. They started scholarship funds for Wellesley High School students who wanted to extend their art education afterwards. And they would give annual donations to the college in sort of a thank you for helping the society out. And interestingly enough, one year as a special thank you, they gave this original Picasso print, which still is in the Davis Museum collection. So this was sort of the World War II era Wellesley Square. This is Betty Huntington, the daughter of the star of the show, Elizabeth Huntington. And you can see the Red Cross on the right, which is part of the things that we were talking about before. On the left, you see what now we would call the DePrisco building, and where the Cafe Mangal is, and doesn't look a whole lot different except for the cars and maybe a little more parking. So moving forward to sort of the later part of the 20th century, one of the really important figures was Margaret Fitzwilliam. I didn't know her personally, but speaking to others that knew her, felt that from the very start, she was one of the most caring and generous people that they've ever met, in addition to being a world-class artist. So she was well trained at Case Western in Ohio, went on to get a graduate degree at Yale and a Carnegie scholarship, eventually found her way to Wellesley, where I think she spent roughly 60 more years painting away with the Wellesley Society of Artists. She was briefly the president in the 1970s. And then in the 1990s, when the society needed an experienced hand to kind of roll up their sleeves and help out, she took over the reins again and became sort of the second longest contributing president that the society ever had. She won awards down in Boston at the Copley Society. Our organization still gives an annual watercolor award in her memory. And during her lifetime, she had exhibitions, the Cordova Museum, the prestigious Boston Guild of Artists, the Cleveland Museum, and Federal Reserve Bank. So after the society was no longer had space at the college, we had to look for more places to exhibit. So over the years, that included a whole bunch of places: Babson College, Mass Bay College, Wellesley Junior High School, when there still was a junior high school, multiple local banks and stores, all the branches of the Wellesley Free Library and the Maugus Club. Nowadays, this has become our favorite place. The Wellesley Free Library's main branch has been unbelievably supportive to our society and to art in general. You may have seen the new sculpture outside by Nancy Shern, the Make Way for Ducklings sculpture, which was just installed a couple of weeks ago. And if you look around, not only here in the Wakeland room, but you'll see art encouragement almost anywhere you can turn your head. So it's just a wonderful place. In recent years, we've also expanded from the library to other sites in Natick and Weston, and continue to look for and expand for new venues to have some fun. Also, into the 20th century, obviously, a sophisticated website and other online offerings started up with the society. This just is some examples of what the society does today. This is hanging one of the annual shows. Our friend Fritz is in the audience today. Thanks for coming, Fritz. I promised to show him a nice picture of him when he was so young and handsome. One of my problems putting this together is it's like hard to cover 90 years because there are so many great artists and wonderful people within the society. And just, you can't do that in 45 minutes to an hour. So I had to pick super special people. And Fritz definitely met that criteria. So on the left, you'll see a painting that he did some time ago of the town hall here. And I like his reconstruction so much better than what it looks like now when it's surrounded with plastic and barbed wire and so on and so forth. Well, Fritz had a wonderful, extremely important career in architecture, including, among others, portions of Logan Airport. And then he decided that he really wanted to follow his true love for fine art, and became probably an even better artist than he was a great architect. He became a president of the society, a member of the prestigious Boston Guild of Artists, and recently in the last few years has made an honorary life member for all of his contributions. He's many times given donations of his artwork for the benefit of the Wellesley Society, for which we're eternally grateful. Now, this gentleman, Roger Castell, I've never met, and I had in the talk, and I just learned, sadly, 48 hours ago that a couple of weeks ago he passed away at age 92. And he was, and Nancy knew him quite well, and he was an unbelievably great artist and a beautiful human being, generous, humble, and he's going to be sorely missed. Here he is just a few years ago with his beautiful nature painting, Bluebird, for which he won first prize that year at our society show. But he's, in a way, he's kind of like Fritz. He had two careers. Before he started doing these beautiful pictures of animals and nature, which he loved, he had a very important career as an illustrative artist. And who can forget the Jaws poster, and probably one of the most iconic, most memorable movie posters that you can ever think of, in addition to having his hand in The Empire Strikes Back, and was a very important illustrative artist. And of course, my favorite, Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze. So the society has been intimately connected and working with the community for 90 years, or if you want to fudge it and say 99 years, because we really sort of started in 1924 with the Women's Club. Has done a whole bunch of things. Recently, as I mentioned before, there is an annual award given to worthy Wellesley High School students. And on your way out, the two paintings that you will see on your left as you exit are the paintings of the two students that won this year's award from the society. This year, we were very active in the Wellesley Wonderful Weekend. And many of the artists of the society painted and donated scenes from around Wellesley, and they were auctioned off at Page Waterman Gallery for the benefit of the veterans and the Wellesley Wonderful Weekend. Shortly after that, additional artists donated their personal artwork to the Rotary Club's Taste of Wellesley, which is a wonderful program that they do to try to help out the problem with food insecurity in Wellesley and surrounding areas. Early on during the Ukrainian War, we had a special exhibition called Sunflowers for Peace, where artists in the society all drew some sort of sunflower motif of their choice. They were all sold off to benefit humanitarian needs in the war and the Ukraine. And it goes on with collections for the Wellesley Food Pantry and many other worthy organizations. In 2015, obviously, the society became a nonprofit organization, and therefore everything that you see, all the exhibitions, demonstrations, lectures, critiques, so on and so forth, online programs are all free and open to the public. Just like in World War II during COVID, Nancy and her colleagues rolled up their sleeves and still put on Zoom exhibitions. And in year 2020, over 1,000 people saw the online only when live exhibitions were not available in those times. Here's Dottie with one of the previous winners of the high school award. This is a sampling of the paintings that were done for Sunflowers for Peace. I think, Nancy, you got to ride in a convertible because the society was honored with a special recognition in honor of her 90 years of the organization, and a whole bunch of other people marched in the parade and had a good time. The only sad thing is we were trying to revive an art festival in town, which used to be done years ago. And we had tents and all organized to have a wonderful giant exhibition and festival next to the library under the tents on Saturday. And it was the rainiest day of the year. So you got the parade and a small little table in the Honeywell field, but it was still a lot of fun. It was a fun, important exhibition about 5 years ago, where Wellesley combined with surrounding communities and with interesting collaborations with Newton, Needham, Natick, and Watertown, where artists from all 5 towns put on a gigantic exhibition in Watertown. We've collaborated with a whole bunch of other people. Garden Club, Heart and Bloom used to be a fairly regular event. We have an annual demonstration that is done jointly with the Needham Art Association, alternating between their site and our site with a well-known national or local artist. And there have been recent plein air events at Elm Bank, one of them by invitation of the prestigious Boston Guild. So in 2023, sort of in my mind, the excellence continues. And you see examples of some of the current members: Laura Maida, Gail Nichols, Elizabeth Fawcett, Maria Babb. So there's still a whole lot of amazing art produced by the current members, in addition to the unbelievable history of the founding members. So things have obviously changed, and they're continuing to change. Before I started, Fritz asked me, well, what about the future of art with AI? And I almost had no answer for him, because I don't think anybody knows, and most of us feel it for the art world is probably not going to be good. But the point, in summing up, almost 90 years ago, Elizabeth Huntington said, Wellesley Society's main objective was humanitarian, and its main goal was to bring an artistic consciousness to youth of both beauty and human accomplishment. And when you're talking about AI, I guess in one sense, it's a form of human accomplishment, but there's nothing like human accomplishment of seeing the work and the skill and the time that goes into a great piece of real art. So I think the society has taken that motive from Elizabeth Huntington and kind of taken it one step forward, where we feel it's not just for the youth, although we feel strongly that youth is extremely important, but that art can be really an important lifetime endeavor. I mean, there's not many things that you can do from the time that you're 2 and 102 and have fun and contribute and bring beauty to the world other than fine art, and hopefully bring some joy and express feelings and bringing meaning to life. So going forward in the future, the society remains dedicated to bringing fine art to Wellesley, but also, as we've been doing for 90 years, its surrounding communities through its exhibitions, demonstrations, workshops, through philanthropic and other educational programs. So thank you very much for coming. I'm awake, I'm out of bed, I'm dressed. What more do you want? Maybe a couple of questions. I still can't answer your AI question first. I'm sorry. I'm not sure if anybody can. Any questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
I was struck by one of the artists about diversity these days in the society, and just what your thoughts are about that. Is it an issue, or any thoughts about that kind of question? We have Native American members, we have members of color.
I don't. I mean, I think that my personal feeling about it is probably similar to the Wellesley Society, is that at least our group is open to everybody. Doesn't matter race, color, creed, what color your toenails are, or if you love art and you can produce something decent, everybody is welcome. Would you agree with that, Nance? With that said, part of my discussion with Fritz was how, obviously the art has been changing since the beginning of time, obviously, and will continue to change. And AI will be a version of that. And then there will be massive arguments about whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. There's already huge arguments going on even before AI about, sort of the stuff that most people hang in their homes. Fights between the abstract expressionists and people who are into realism and impressionism and so on and so forth. So I think some of those arm wrestling matches will just probably go on for a long time, and there'll be new ones coming on that we haven't even anticipated. Yes.
Did the profile of your members be what's, the atmosphere, how would you describe what people paint, what your members are painting? Yeah, sorry, just because talking about your membership, current membership, the type of artists, and what their background are, how they came to art, like you come after.
Well, if you look around on your way out, you'll see that it kind of looks like most of the things kind of realistic or impressionistic. But if you look around, you'll see oils, you'll see watercolors, you'll see woodblock prints, you'll see pastels, you'll see realism, you'll see impressionism, you'll see some pop art type things, you'll see some folk art. I don't think that we intentionally make it that way, but the society is ever expanding. It started with about 13 members. By World War II, it was up to about 50. Now it's maybe 120 or something like that. So we'll welcome all society everyone in the society, it doesn't really matter what type of art they're creating, and as long as they don't have to be professionals either, but sort of deliver a decent product in whatever their chosen genre is. Yes,
I was gonna say the society has a wonderful website. And on the website, there is an artist page and a profile of each of our artists that shows 2 or 3 of their artworks. And it's wonderful to take a look at it. And we have what, 110?
Yeah, there are about 100, there are 110 exhibiting members. And as Dottie said, the website, if you go to the website, you can see the gallery of all of our exhibiting members. But I would say, just off the top of my head, maybe a little less than a third are what I would call professional artists. And then the rest are what I would call serious amateurs. So it really is a mix.
there are 2 categories for people that want to become members. If you want to become an exhibiting member, there's a committee that what you do as an individual is you send a resume, a little bit about your background, and several samples of work that you've done. There's a committee. The nice thing is that it's all done online. You don't have to schlep it over to Nancy's house or whatever. And basically they look over the resume and the samples, which they assume are probably some of your better works, and they say yes or no. And it seems like lately they're saying yes to a lot of people. So a lot of people still interested in fine art and still very good at it. And then there's also an associate membership for people that are just starting out painting, or just art history lovers, just like art in general, or they're artists, but they're a little bit shy and they're not quite ready to kind of strut their stuff in front of an audience. And that all can be found on the website, how to apply to either of those categories. Yes?
Well, I've got a crossover question for you. I've always been curious. In the 1890s, there was a very famous muckraking journalist named Ida Tarbell. And is she part of the same family as Edmund Tarbell?
That I don't know. Maybe you could answer the question. I do know that Tarbell was from Groton, is where he was born. If the woman that you referred to is, they may have been cousins or something like that, but I don't know about the family history that well. In fact, I thought it was a little sneaky putting Tarbell in there because he actually wasn't a member of the Wellesley Society of Artists. I just thought he was a great teacher and thought it would be interesting. So I didn't dig too deep on him. So thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks. Thank you very much. Yeah. So before all you go, I have a couple announcements before you all go. Several art-related announcements. First of all, thank you, Bob, it was a terrific presentation. I just want to let you all know that in collaboration, not necessarily with Bob, but the society in general. So Betty Huntington, the painting, so the Wellesley Historical Society created a puzzle, and it's Black Friday for you guys today. So you can buy this puzzle, because I know you all have a puzzle fan in your family, and we have these puzzles here. And if you don't get them today, you always get them at the Toll House. Second thing is Bob's written the history of the Wellesley Society of Artists, and that book is available also today. And it's also available at the Toll House. I also I'm sorry, long announcements today, but since this is the artist crowd, we are having a speaker in January. He's from Wellesley College, the art history department, and he's going to be talking about his book on John Singer Sargent. So I invite all of you to come in January. It's on our website. And I want to say one more. We have another speaker coming in December, and she happens to be in the audience right now. And she's speaking on holiday traditions from the Roman Empire. So that's going to be on December 19th. And so Miss Caroline Murphy was set back there. She's a PhD student at University of Michigan and a great personal friend of their parents and our children. So I hope you had a great time. We have cookies, water, coffee. And Bob's here. Do you have anything else?
Just one other, the history of the society. I don't get a penny from that. It all goes to the Wellesley Society of Artists, and a lot of it will end up going to next year's High School Achievement Award.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming and have a great day.